And at the end of the day, to use a teacher term, we've really got to be able to connect the dots. Take a look at policy, take a look at money, take a look at organizations like Teach for America, and try to ask critical questions like, why are those with the money giving it to these organizations and advocating for these specific policies?
Welcome to Truth for America. I'm Julian Vasquez Heilig. I'm your co-host. I'm a professor of education, leadership, and policy studies at California State University, Sacramento. I also currently serve as the elected education chair of the California NAACP. And I'm here with my co-host.
Hi, I'm Jameson Brewer. I'm a recent PhD graduate from the University of Illinois in educational policy studies, and I'm currently serving as an adjunct professor at DePaul University. I was a 2010 Metro Atlanta Corps member.
Thank you, Jameson. And we also have a special guest with us today. If he could go ahead and introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Reverend Kyle J. Boyer. I serve as a middle school social studies teacher in a suburban school district outside of the city of Philadelphia. And I am a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania with both masters in education and public administration. I was a 2010 Greater Philadelphia Corps member in Teach for America.
Today we're going to talk about Teach for America's funding and where does that money come from, and is there potentially an agenda behind the money that Teach for America receives? Recently, I was reading a new book by Megan Tompkins, who is a professor at the Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. And they sent me an advanced copy of the book before it came out. Now this book is out. It's called Policy Patrons, or maybe I should say that in English, Policy Patrons, Philanthropy, Education Reform, and the Politics of Influence. What's really interesting about this book is she had the opportunity to interview more than 50 folks inside of various foundations across the United States. We, of course, know over the last 10 years that foundations have really changed their role in terms of how they seek to influence public policy, and specifically education policy in our case. So you might be thinking, what does this have to do with Teach for America? What does the funding that Teach for America do? How does it impact necessarily their agenda? And so I wanted to read a couple of questions sort of as a jumping off point for our conversation today. In her first chapter, Professor Tompkins says, do the Foundation's advancements of its educational aims align with the preferences of the broader public? Because as we know, foundations such as the Walton Family Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, and many other smaller foundations have been pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into Teach for America and other, quote, education reform causes over the last decade or so. She continues, was it beneficial for democracy to have powerful institutions like foundations push otherwise ignored issues onto the political agenda and marshal their considerable resources towards addressing these issues? Could these actions be seen as detrimental, elevating preferences of private interests with few structured accountability mechanisms? And do foundations' power to advance certain solutions to public problems have the potential to influence policy and practice without a single vote being cast? And I think that's a really interesting question. So if you look at Teach for America's donors, you take a look at their 2015 supporters and financials. Where does Teach for America's money come from? And I first started to look into this when I was writing the policy briefs for the National Education Policy Center. I wrote one in around 2010 called Review of the Evidence. Then later, we wrote another one called A Return to the Evidence for the National Education Policy Center. And this one I first started to look at where is it that Teach for America's funding comes from. So you can see on their 2015 financial statement that the largest share of their monies comes from foundations, 29%. Another 27% comes from individuals and fundraising events. Then they break out separately state and local fees and federal funding. And so actually, if you put state and local monies together, you would come up with 36%. Corporations commit another 8%. So then there's the question, well, who are the big spenders on TFA's revenue sheet? You can see that in their largest donation areas, there's an anonymous donor. Then there's Arthur Rock, who we know and we've talked about in previous episodes, funds the Teach for America Corps members on the Hill as education staffers for Republicans and Democrats. We talked about how the BAT teachers encountered these fellows when they had their day on the Hill. And then the Walton Family Foundation, also a $5 million plus gift. But we know that the Walton funds have come in at $50 million in Los Angeles. Walton family have given another $50 million to Teach for America in Arkansas. So I want to now bring in our guest, Kyle Boyer, former TFA in the East Coast, and also my co-host Jameson Brewer, to get their thoughts. What are your thoughts? What are your reactions? Do you think that this money from the Walton Family Foundation, from the Gates Foundation, from the Broad Foundation, are there any strings attached? What kind of agenda do these foundations have in giving the lion's share of the money that Teach for America receives?
So we know that Walton, Gates, Broad are unabashed supporters of corporate-style reform policies, whether that be advocating for the expansion of testing, whether that be advocating for timed teacher evaluation to test, whether that be the expansion and mass proliferation of charter schools. So we find these organizations being on the front line of supporting these policies and supporting the expansion of these policies. It's probably ignorant to think that when Gates, Broad, Walton, etc., offer this money to Teach for America, they're not expecting Teach for America to similarly advocate for these kind of policies.
Well, and for me, and I agree with what Kyle said, I also think about it from an ideological perspective, right? So we know, obviously, the Walton Foundation gets their money through their business of Walmart, one of the largest employers in the United States, one of the most quote-unquote successful businesses in the United States. But we also know the detriment that Walmarts tend to have in local areas, right? So they underemploy the people, they pay them just above minimum wage, and so there's a large social and economic detriment that happens in places that Walmart sets up shop. And so for me, I think it's interesting to think about this from an ideological standpoint. We know the negative impacts that Walmart has on local areas. We know their negative impact globally in the way that they do manufacturing. And so for me, the question that I've always had, and I've asked many folks in Teach for America, is how can an organization or how can a foundation that makes money, that relies on social and economic inequality, they rely on that, how is it that they are interested in taking the profits from that type of business and putting it into fixing education in such a way, and with the amount of rhetoric that talks about ending social and economic inequity? Even just from a holistic business standpoint, it doesn't make sense that Walmart would be interested in ending systemic inequality because their business model was shut down. And so for me, I think it's important to stand back and get a larger picture of the ideology between how systemic inequalities happen and stratification happen in our society, both economically, racially, and I think we ought to ask the question of the money that comes from that, and in fact, the poster child for economic inequality through corporate America in the United States is one of Teach for America's largest funders. It doesn't seem to me to align with a desire to end the type of system and structure that has brought Walmart into the success that the corporation has had for the past a handful of decades.
So it sounds like what you're saying, Jameson, is that Walmart and Teach for America are really unlikely bedfellows if you were to think of Teach for America as a civil rights organization, because if Walmart is the type of company that underpays its employees, often doesn't offer them health insurance, often finds tax breaks in communities, which means that ultimately that money doesn't go to schools from property taxes, then that is essentially tampering down on the opportunities that students may have in local public schools because of the way that Walmart operates their business. But it sounds to me that what you're saying is that maybe that this is a Walmartization of the profession, because essentially Teach for America teachers have a similar experience to Walmart workers, because essentially they're de-skilled and they're paid poorly. I think about it just really pains my heart when I think about the conversations that we had with the Teach for America teachers from the Bay Area who told us that their starting pay was at $33,000, and then Teach for America was requiring them to commit half of their salary to working on a master's in special ed that they didn't feel was actually valuable to their classroom practice. So they were essentially living on $13,000 or $14,000 in the Bay Area, which is one of the most expensive places to live in the world. But that really sounds like the Walmartization of teaching. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you saying that Walmart has de-skilled their workers, I think it's very apt to say that that's what Teach for America has done to the teaching profession, right? It's the idea that we can de-skill it and we can atomize it out in such a way that we can pick and choose what's important to know and what's not important to know before you become the teacher of record. And they've repackaged that into an 18-hour student teaching stint. So it's the Walmartization of teaching, and within the larger corporate area, it's also the McDonaldization of teaching, right? So there's a great book about the McDonaldization of society, came out a handful of years ago. And this idea of teaching in such a standardized way that there's some type of recipe for good teaching, and that if you simply follow the routine and the recipe, that your students will always be successful, and when they're not, we know who's to blame, and it's you. Obviously, that sets up unrealistic expectations for core members, and I agree with you that this idea of not supporting really financially and putting core members into precarious financial situations is very similar to what Walmart does to its workers. But I think it's all within the larger corporate or umbrella of corporate approaches to education, and thinking that we ought to approach educating children in the same way that we approach manufacturing large retail goods, but also the way that we make Big Macs, right? This idea that if you have a Big Mac in Atlanta, it will taste the exact same as if you have a Big Mac in Los Angeles, right? This idea that everything should be standardized, that all children learn the same way, and all children should have the same type of educational output. Then more often than not, within Teach for America's approach to education, and even outside of TFA, because of all of these big financial organizations and donors like the Walton Foundation, that is increasingly becoming educational outputs that are very limited to test scores.
I agree with what Jameson said. I think the one thing I would add is that we don't have to guess what Walton and others are trying to accomplish. These are organizations that, like many others, have strategic plans, and they're very explicit about their desire to change the direction of education, regardless of governance structure, regardless of the way that adults are trained. They're very explicit about their intentions.
I think that your point about governance is well taken, and I think it's a really good segue to Broad Foundation, which really focuses on governance. And you see, for example, the Broad Fellows finding their way into very powerful positions. For example, you see Kastarfin in Atlanta. You see Antoine Wilson in Oakland. You saw Mike Miles in Dallas. And so you see these broad trained superintendents coming in, and they're supposed to be leading the public district. They're supposed to be leading Oakland. They're supposed to be leading Atlanta. They're supposed to be leading Dallas. But what you see them doing is kowtowing to charter schools. And then I asked myself, well, what's the relationship between Eli Broad, who is a real estate magnate, charter schools, Teach for America, and finding ways to put education reformer-style folks into these different leadership positions? Could you connect the dots for me on how you think these different things are related? Why would Eli Broad be giving millions of dollars to Teach for America?
I can speak from experience. I know that in the Philadelphia area, Dr. Bill Hite, the Philadelphia School District Superintendent, nice enough guy, but he as well is a Broad alumni. So we see, like you said, Julian, Broad Academy alumni in very high-powered positions, supporting things like the expansion of charter schools.
Right. And so what do you think, what's the relationship between charters, real estate, Teach for America? What do you think that relationship is?
Well, there's certainly an opportunity for profit there. One of the controversies that many individuals have identified with regards to charter schools is, again, that governance piece. So a charter school board owning a piece of property and then allowing the charter school to get public funds to rent from the property and kind of taking from the public, making a profit.
Right. What's interesting is 1/3 of all Teach for America teachers teach in charter schools. And many prominent alums, of course, have started charter school networks. Of course, the largest charter school network in the United States, started by David Levin and Mike Feinberg, the KIPP charter schools, have many Teach for America teachers. One of my own students from the University of Texas went to teach with Teach for America at KIPP in San Antonio, and she actually had a nervous breakdown because she wasn't prepared to handle what she encountered in San Antonio. And that was actually one of the most popular blog posts on cloaking inequity. It's called Isolation, Shame, and Burnout. And so what's interesting about this connection, too, I think, is, for example, in Chicago, you see Rangel, who was the campaign, chairman for Rahm Emanuel. Rahm Emanuel, of course, closed about 50 schools in primarily black neighborhoods. And then the contracts for those charter schools, not surprisingly, found their way to Juan Rangel. And just a few weeks ago, the Justice Department, I believe, settled with him because of what was, these problematic connections in Chicago. Jameson, Kyle, if I offered to sell you something twice, the exact same thing, you bought it from me twice, would you say yes to that?
No.
How about you, Kyle? If I offered to sell you the same thing twice, would you buy it?
100% no.
And so I think one of the challenges that we're seeing with charter schools, for example, in places like Chicago, they've offered, public school buildings for $1 in some cases. In other places, maybe $60,000 for the property in the building. If you think about our parents' generation or our grandparents' generation, they built these schools, these public schools, with their tax dollars. And now what's been happening is as they close these schools, they sell them on the cheap. And then sometimes these charters will sell them to a leasing company and then lease the school back to the charter school. So essentially what's happened is we are paying for that school building twice, right? And so there is, I think, a profit motive. We often talk about charters as being public schools, but they're privately controlled. And so the money of those schools, the real estate associated with those schools, is all privately controlled by the people who control those buildings. So I can understand why real estate developers, why Wall Street are really interested in the potential bonds associated with charter schools. I can understand why We would want a ready force of charter school teachers from Teach for America, because you have this movement to privately control these schools and privately control the financials associated with those schools.
Yeah, and Julian, I remember Diane Ravitch in her book Reign of Error writes about this. She writes about real estate investment trusts and how they've often talked about the lucrative nature of charter schools because there's so much property involved.
Right, and some of that property is in prime locations in many cities, right? You know, you think about the city of Houston. There used to be a freedmen's town right near downtown when I first moved to Houston. So the key is, if you want to gentrify an area, what you do is you close the black schools in that area. And then what you can do is you can redevelop that property, because I think what folks have discovered over time is that they no longer want to commute into downtown in an hour and a half of traffic every day. So why not, where you have black communities in Chicago or black communities in Houston that live right in the shadow of the city, close their schools, spread them out, gentrify the areas in which they live, and that all starts with closing their public schools and reopening charter schools.
Absolutely. And the same is the case in the city of Philadelphia, where we also had a mass closure of schools a few years ago. A very famous high school comes to mind, the old West Philadelphia High School, that's now going to be converted into luxury apartments.
Right, and so you see the same playbook in Philadelphia, you see the same playbook in New Orleans, you see the same playbook in Chicago, and Oakland right now, right this very minute, this is the exact playbook that they are trying to prosecute in that city too. What do you think, Jameson?
I really think, again, it's important to think about it in a large ideological perspective. Unfortunately, because everyone in the United States has had some type of K-12 experience, it has been my experience that everyone tends to have a solution on how to fix schools. But of course, it starts with the assumption that schools are broken, right? And so in order to shut down schools, so take Chicago, for example, in order to shut down schools, you first have to get people who are in positions of power, and usually the folks who elect them, to buy into this idea that schools are broken, the schools have failed, the teachers are to blame, and in that process, sell them the solution. And there's often a ready-made solution. In the case of school closings, it tends to take on the form of charter schools. But I think that because everyone has experience in education, when I have conversations with folks about Teach for America, I tend to try to remove it from TFA. And Julian, you've done a lot of good work with this on your blog. And instead of talking specifically about Teach for America and changing it to something else, like would the populace be okay with pilots for America, right? Would our population be okay with doctors for America? And so going back to what you said earlier about paying for buildings, for example, twice, would local communities really be okay if that's what we were doing with our local libraries, our public libraries, right? Selling them, in effect, to private organizations that are going to resell what is there as far as the property and the materials inside for their own profit. And if you're making the connection to charter schools, making decisions on who gets to come in, who gets to stay in, right? And so I find it really hard to believe that any community would be okay with a local library deciding who gets to come in and read and who doesn't, what library has certain services and which ones don't. And so it's unfortunately so easy, I think, to see this happen in education because we have really bought into this idea of the failed school, and it is just, the environment is so ripe for corporate reformers and venture philanthropists, right? So I really think that's where it comes down to. Professor Ken Saltman has done some of this work on what's the difference between scientific philanthropy of the early 20th century versus venture philanthropy, and there's a real big difference, right? And I think that education is the perfect realm for them to do that, and is it a question of, are these individuals doing it because they had evil intentions? I want to give folks the benefit of the doubt and really hope that that's not the case. But what that leaves us with is just ignorance, right? And we see too many policies being made specific in education from people who are in charge mostly of money that aren't listening to teachers, that aren't listening to people who have had experiences there. And they're relying on cheaper alternatives, and as Kyle said, most often with some type of profit motive.
If you ask the average Teach for America teacher, right, they don't feel like they're a part of a broader conversation about the direction of public education and the private control and the privatization of education. And let me give you another example. So I got a call from a school board member, and she told me that when she was getting elected, the charter school lobby came to her and said, you know, we would like you to support charter schools. Now, mind you, she's running for the school board of a large urban district, right? And the charter school lobby is saying, you know, we want your support, we want your votes down the road. And so she was new to politics, and she said, yeah, you know, I'm open to this. Then checks, she told me, started to show up in the mail from all over the United States, all different people she didn't know, big checks, adding up to about $500,000. And she told me that she talked with her husband about it, and she said, you know, that I think there's something not quite right here. You know, I haven't figured out exactly what it is, but, you know, as I get used, you know, as I go into this, she was elected, as I go down the road, I want to understand what is the broader, what's really happening here. And I think that a lot of Teach for America Corps members, you know, a lot of people who used to send their kids to charter school, I'm one of those people who in the past sent his child to a charter school. I think that for a lot of people, there's really a come to Jesus moment, right? So, you know, if I could just ask you a little personally, like for you, Jameson, when was that come to Jesus moment? And then let's go to Kyle. Where was that come to Jesus moment where you saw what was going on with Teach for America was part of a broader trend, a broader movement?
Yeah, you know. I've been fortunate to share my story in other places, and it's important to point out that I'm a traditionally certified teacher. I joined Teach for America at the height of the recession, and only because somebody encouraged me to apply. I had not heard of Teach for America before that, and so I went in knowing nothing of the organization. I actually felt really good about the rhetoric on the website and the conversations and the interviews that I went through to get into the organization. It was exciting to think that you really were on the front lines of the new civil rights movement, that you were really making an impact. And of course, I know that good teachers do. For me, one of the very first days of the Institute, when the curriculum specialist shared with us the academic impact model that effectively held core members as the sole bear responsibility for whether their students succeeded or didn't. And having come from a traditional training background where you're exposed to dozens of different ways of thinking about teaching, different methods and instructions, it really struck me as odd that there was this one very specific, narrow way that Teach for America was teaching its core members on how to teach. And so given my experience in theory classes and methods classes, and of course doing student teaching, I felt immediately concerned that there was a group of folks who have no background or experience in education being told that this is the one best way. And so in looking into the organization further, actually finding out a little bit about who were the financial donors, this idea that we can standardize teaching in an effort to standardize students. It really struck me as odd, and I started asking tough questions during the CS or curriculum specialist meetings, so much so that our CS pulled me aside and said that she wanted to have a pull-out session to address some of my concerns, and that she was going to open it up to the rest of the Atlanta Corps that year, and they could all come. Of course, it was never open to the entire Corps. I ended up in a room with about a dozen of other Corps members, some of the more, and I'm doing air quotes, the stronger Corps members who were there to effectively get me back in line with the Teach for America brand of thinking.
So are you telling me that they had an intervention for you because you were off you'd gone off the wagon? Is that what you're telling me?
It was exactly an intervention, and I was already really starting to struggle with being involved with Teach for America. That was the last nail in the coffin from a core member's perspective. And I call in intervention, and I talk about them being stronger core members because the following summer I worked as a SOM, school operations manager, and part of my job was literally listening into conversations that core members were having and identifying core members who were asking really critical questions of Teach for America. And the CMAs, the core member advisors, would talk about which ones they needed to pull out for individual conversations or which ones they needed to reorganize and get into either groups or even have these sort of intervention conversations with some stronger core members to sort of get these core members back in check because asking these questions are not something that is encouraged at all. And so for me, when that happened to me, I knew right away, that was really the end moment of knowing for a fact that the organization was problematic. Mostly, at least in that point of view of my time, mostly from a pedagogical standpoint, because again, I'm a teacher. That's what I think about first. And so that was it. It was the intervention, and I've seen it happen to other people, and it's been problematic ever since.
So Kyle, Jamison, thank you so much for sharing that evolution that you had. Could you tell me, Kyle, a little bit about, did you have a come to Jesus moment, or was there an evolution as you saw all these different pieces, the charter schools, the money from the Walton Foundation, the money from the Broad Foundation, the money from Arthur Rock, all of these different pieces. Tell us a little bit about how you came to a more critical realization of Teach for America.
Yeah, Julian, I definitely didn't have a come to Jesus moment per se. I can say conclusively that it was more of an evolution, and that critical evolution came about primarily through studies. As part of being a Greater Philadelphia core member, I was getting my master's at Penn simultaneously while serving in the classroom, and that really gave me an opportunity to study, to engage critically, and to see the policies behind the organization and to connect the dots, to put two and two together, if you will, to see the organization, the foundations, the entities supporting certain reforms that I knew I didn't agree with, and to see how in many cases they were not working and they were doing detrimental things. And if I could take just one more step back, I kind of feel like a mutt sometimes because I was educated, although I grew up in a neighborhood that was primarily minority, lower to middle income. The greater area was affluent, great suburban public schools, without a doubt. And to be thrown into the urban setting and see how these policies were considered appropriate for this group of people, but certainly not the traditional public model that worked so well for others, really caused me to critically engage and start asking questions. And of course, when you ask enough questions, you'll get to some answers and see that the policies that Gates, Broad, Walton are supporting do not improve education as they're purported to do.
Wow. So what you're really saying is that you saw firsthand, separate and unequal, between your public school education and then the urban education that you were thrust into with Teach for America. Is that what you're saying?
100%.
Okay, so I think we're ready to roll into conclusion statements.
Yeah, so thanks, Julian and Kyle, for the conversation. I think that it's important for any current core member or even alumni to ask critical questions about Teach for America, specifically as it relates to money. When I was a core member, Teach for America entered me into the Sponsor Teacher campaign, and a very large, prominent attorney firm or law firm in downtown Atlanta gave $10,000 to the Sponsor Teacher campaign in my name. But I think that what's important to understand about most of Teach for America, when you're talking about whether it's $10,000 or the $500 million that they have in net assets, we don't really know how a lot of the money is being used, and a lot of it is a lot of trickery in a lot of sense. The $10,000 that was given to my classroom for the Sponsor Teacher classroom, not a single penny went to my classroom or my students. The money is used in Teach for America's recruiting, and they say in training future teachers. And so there's a bit of a shell game when it comes to how Teach for America receives money and where that money ends up at the end of the day. And so I think that all of us should be asking these questions, but it really needs to start with critical core members and alums asking their organization, where is this money coming from, where is it going, and what strings are attached.
Thank you, Julian and Jameson, for a great conversation. My advice to a core member, incoming core member, anyone else who cares about these issues would be to read, engage critically, ask questions. There are some great resources that really take an examiner's look and pour through some of these issues and can give us succinct, quick answers to very complex questions and give us a language and a vocabulary for what's wrong. While I was in the Corps, I knew that I didn't feel right, that I didn't spiritually or otherwise really feel good about some of the things that I was seeing policy-wise. And then reading Valerie Strauss, Diane Ravitch, these were the folks who gave me a language for my critical engagement. So I would encourage others to do the same. And at the end of the day, to use a teacher term, we really got to be able to connect the dots. Take a look at policy, take a look at money, take a look at organizations like Teach for America, and try to ask critical questions like, why are those with the money giving it to these organizations and advocating for these specific policies?